Most of what people believe about survival didn't come from survival experts. It came from movies, from a friend who heard it from another friend, from an article that sounded confident enough to trust. And a lot of it is wrong in a specific way. Not randomly wrong, but wrong because it sounds like it should be true. That's the actual problem. A myth that felt made up wouldn't survive. The dangerous ones survive because they follow a kind of internal logic. Rubbing something cold to warm it up sounds reasonable. Drinking your own fluids when you have none sounds like resourcefulness. Playing dead in front of an animal sounds like submission working the way it does with a dog. None of that logic matches how bodies, animals, or physics actually behave, but it's persuasive enough to repeat. So instead of listing 30 random facts, it's worth understanding where these myths cluster, because the clusters reveal the pattern. Bad advice about cold, bad advice about water, bad advice about animals, bad advice about injuries. Each group fails for a different reason, and once you see the reason, the correct version stops needing to be memorized. It starts making sense on its own. Cold exposure is where some of the oldest myths live. Alcohol is still treated as a way to warm up in the cold. It does the opposite. Alcohol dilates the blood vessels near your skin, which pushes warm blood outward toward the surface. You feel warmer because that blood is closer to your nerves, but you're actually losing heat faster since your skin is now the biggest exposed surface radiating it away. It also blunts shivering, which is one of the body's main ways of generating heat through muscle activity. So the drink that feels like a fix accelerates the exact process it's supposedly preventing. Frostbite has its own myth. Rub it to bring back circulation. Frostbitten tissue has ice crystals forming inside the cells. Rubbing that tissue doesn't restore blood flow. It mechanically shreds cells that are already damaged and fragile, which can turn a recoverable injury into permanent tissue loss. The correct approach is gradual, controlled rewarming, ideally with medical guidance, not friction. And there's a widespread idea that most of your body heat escapes through your head, so a hat solves cold exposure. The head loses heat roughly in proportion to how much skin it exposes compared to the rest of you. No more, no less. The reason older cold weather guidance emphasized head coverage is that in a lot of real scenarios, the head was often the only uncovered skin, since the rest of the body was already dressed. Cover an exposed neck, wrists, or torso, and you'll lose just as much heat there. The myth generalized a specific situation into a universal rule. Water introduces a different kind of failure. The myths sound like clever workarounds, but the body doesn't work like an engineering problem. Drinking urine to survive dehydration is one of the most repeated pieces of bad advice in survival media. Urine is water the kidneys have already used to remove waste and concentrated solutes from your blood. Reintroducing that waste doesn't add usable fluid. It adds a further burden on kidneys that are already trying to conserve water, and it can accelerate dehydration rather than delay it. There's also the belief that moss only grows on the north side of trees, so it can be used for reliable navigation. Moss grows wherever it's damp and shaded, which is often the north side in the northern hemisphere, but that pattern breaks constantly, depending on tree cover, terrain, and local moisture. Trusting it as a compass substitute has sent people in the wrong direction more than once. And in moving water, the instinct to swim directly against a current, to fight straight back toward shore, is one of the most dangerous reactions a person can have, particularly in a rip current. Rip currents aren't strong enough to pull a person under. They're strong enough to exhaust a person trying to swim against them. The water usually narrows a short distance out. Swimming parallel to the shore, or simply floating until the pull weakens, uses far less energy than a direct fight against a current that's stronger than a person's sustained swimming speed. Wildlife myths persist because they borrow logic from domestic animals, which behave nothing like wild ones. Playing dead is treated as a universal response to any dangerous animal encounter. It's specific, situational advice that got flattened into a blanket rule. It can reduce aggression from a defensive grizzly bear that's protecting cubs or a food source, because the goal there is to convince the bear you're not a threat. It does the opposite with a predatory animal, including a black bear that has decided you're prey, because stillness there just makes you easier to handle. The correct response depends entirely on the species and the animal's apparent motivation. which is exactly why just play dead fails as a universal rule. Snake bites carry maybe the most cinematic myth of all. Cut the wound and suck out the venom. Venom moves into the bloodstream and lymphatic system within minutes, faster than suction can meaningfully remove it. Cutting the skin adds a second wound, risks infection, and can damage tissue and blood vessels near the bite. The actual priority is keeping the person calm and still, since movement speeds venom circulation, and getting them to medical care as fast as possible. There's also a belief that all snakes, spiders, or wild plants can be identified as safe or dangerous by a simple visual rule. Bright colors mean poison, dull colors mean safety, or vice versa, depending on which version someone heard. Toxicity in nature doesn't follow one universal color code across species and regions. Some of the most dangerous organisms are dull and easy to overlook, and some harmless ones are strikingly colored. Treating any single visual shortcut as reliable removes the actual skill, which is species-specific identification. Injury and medical myths are dangerous because they get applied in the moment people are least equipped to double-check them. Tourniquets were long taught as a last resort, something to avoid because it might cost a limb. That guidance has shifted. For severe, life-threatening limb bleeding that isn't responding to direct pressure, a properly applied tourniquet is now widely taught as an early, appropriate step, because uncontrolled blood loss kills far faster than the risk of temporary tourniquet use. The old hesitation cost time in situations where time was the scarcest resource. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke are often treated as the same thing at different severities, which leads people to keep pushing through heat stroke symptoms the way they'd push through exhaustion. Heat stroke means the body's temperature regulation has essentially failed. Core temperature rising, uncontrolled, confusion, sometimes a stop in sweating altogether. At that point, the person needs rapid cooling and emergency care, not rest and water. Treating it like ordinary overheating wastes the window where cooling still works. And there's an old idea that if someone is unconscious after a head injury, you should keep them awake and talking no matter what. Consciousness itself isn't the deciding factor. What matters is getting appropriate medical evaluation, since some serious brain injuries look fine on the surface for a while before symptoms appear. Forcing someone to stay awake doesn't treat the injury. It just delays recognizing that professional care is needed. Fire, shelter, and travel myths tend to fail because they assume ideal conditions that rarely exist. Starting a fire by rubbing two sticks together is shown constantly in survival media as a baseline skill, but it requires very specific dry wood, correct technique, sustained effort, and dry conditions. Exactly the conditions least likely to exist during an actual emergency, when wood is often damp and energy is already limited. It's a real technique, but treating it as a reliable go-to skill overstates how consistently it actually works outside of practiced, ideal circumstances. There's also a persistent idea that if you're lost, you should always follow a stream downhill because it will lead to civilization. Sometimes it will. Streams also lead into terrain that gets steeper, more overgrown, or more hazardous the further they go. And following one blindly can move a person further from any trail or road, rather than closer. The more consistent advice from search and rescue organizations is usually to stay in place once you know you're lost, since a stationary person is dramatically easier to find than one who kept moving in an unpredictable direction. And in a stranded vehicle, the instinct to set out walking for help rather than staying with the car has cost lives specifically because a car is large, visible from the air and from a distance, and holds supplies and shelter, while a person on foot is small, exposed, and covers limited ground before exhaustion or weather becomes the bigger threat. Unless help is known to be very close, staying with the vehicle is usually the safer bet. What connects all of these isn't the individual facts. It's why the wrong version felt right in the first place. Each of these myths borrows logic from somewhere that doesn't actually apply. Comfort logic, movie logic, domestic animal logic, or an outdated version of medical guidance that hasn't caught up in popular memory. None of them are wrong because they're careless ideas. They're wrong because they sound like they should be right, and that's exactly what makes them spread. The actual skill isn't memorizing 30 corrected facts. It's noticing when a piece of advice sounds emotionally satisfying, brave, clever, decisive, instead of being grounded in how the body, the animal, or the environment actually behaves. The satisfying version usually wins the retelling. The accurate version is the one that keeps people alive.